this section, we'll talk about THC versus CBD, and we'll learn what both of those are. We'll review a little bit of the history of how THC and CBD came to be, or at least came to be recognized. We'll understand the differences between THC and CBD, and we'll understand, kind of what circumstances, which type of product might be appropriate. Okay, so let's get started. So THC and CBD are just two of a family of what's called cannabinoids. And cannabinoids are basically just a class of chemicals that they were first identified in the cannabis plant. We have since learned that there are well over 100 cannabinoids, some in very tiny amounts in the cannabis plant, some in higher amounts, and some of these can be manipulated as well. Different cannabinoids, just like different terpenes, will have various physiological effects in the body, and some of them are quite distinctive from the other. The two main ones that we have are tetrahydrocannabinol, which is shortened to THC, and cannabidiol, which is shortened to CBD. Those are our two main cannabinoids that we're going to find in the cannabis plant. The early cannabinoid research actually goes way back into it actually has its roots in the First and the Second World War, because Roger Adams, who lived from 1889 to 1971, he was an American chemist, and he was working in the Chemical Warfare Service of the National Research Council in Washington, D.C. That's in 1917. That was just before the start of the First World War. He was actually tasked with finding a way to protect soldiers from poisonous gas attacks. And the poisonous gas was actually starting to be used in warfare. So there was, of course, countries were looking for ways that they could protect their soldiers and their armed forces. And so Roger Adams was working on this project. And during that time, he was really studying how chemicals affected the body. So he had a good body of knowledge at that point. Fast forward into the 1930s, so 2 years after cannabis had been outlawed in the United States. Now, in the United States, that was about 1936, 1937. In Canada, of course, it had been 1923 when cannabis was banned in Canada. But in the United States, 2 years after cannabis had been banned, he was actually given a special license to work with cannabis. The reason he was asked to work with cannabis is because they were trying to protect or trying to find a truth serum. We'll talk about that again in a minute. But Adam was developing, as he was learning to work with the chemicals in these plants, he patented a method for isolating different chemicals out of the plants. And the first one that he isolated was CBD. Once he isolated CBD in the cannabis plant, he actually went on to make an analog or a synthesized version of both CBD and another cannabinoid called CBN, which we'll talk about at a later time. So he was doing a lot of work in there. By 1942, the work that he had done with extracting things from the cannabis plant really attracted the attention of what would go on to become the CIA, which was then called the Office of Strategic Services. They were trying to develop that truth serum. And so they thought maybe cannabis would, when people got high from cannabis, maybe they would start to tell the truth or something. That was kind of some of the theories that they had back then. It's a really interesting story. It goes into some wild places about some of the urban legends of the CIA that may or may not be true. Some of that stuff we may never know, but Adams was in there. He actually theorized that there was a third chemical, so he had extracted or identified CBD and CBN, and he said, I think there's a third one in there, and it's the third one, that chemical that I can't quite figure out what it is. That's the one that makes people high. And so he had this theory about THC, which is the cannabinoid that gives that psychoactivity, but he couldn't figure it out. And by the way, they didn't make a truth serum out of cannabis either. That was never discovered. But he did manage to synthesize something that was like THC at the time, but he wasn't really able to kind of isolate it from cannabis. So it was a theory that he had, and he was so close, but it would be another 20 years in the early 1960s before THC was actually identified. So kind of standing on the shoulders of atoms, Raphael Mechoulam from Israel kind of took that one step further. And one of the reasons he was able to is because we had better equipment than for isolating different chemicals within the plants. Dr. Mechoulam had the advantage of the nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometer that was a technology that had sort of just been invented that would allow you to kind of look at all the different chemicals and constituents of plant material. So Dr. Mechoulam was able to isolate and identify that THC and basically confirming Adam's theory about it. So as we mentioned earlier, the main cannabinoids found in cannabis are THC and CBD. Now, THC and CBD do not exist in that form in the live cannabis plant. All of the cannabinoids in the live cannabis plant exist as an acid form, so they have an A on the end of that chemical formula. They drop that acid part of the chemical as they get heated. So we really know them as THC and CBD because we're used to ingesting or intaking these products into our body in a heated form. If they weren't heated, so if you're just using like a raw plant, and some people will juice the plant that we'll talk about in a later lesson, so you would be getting those cannabinoids in an acidic form. We're starting to learn that that raw form, or the acidic form, may have really interesting medicinal properties as well. So we may start to, in fact, we already are starting to see some products show up on the market that are THCA and CBDA. There's only a couple of companies out there that are selling them. Canna Farms, I know, is one, but they sell out really quickly. And so if you wanted to try those, you kind of have to kind of stay on their store and catch it when they have a batch come up, and then it might be several months before they put another batch out. But generally, we refer to THC and CBD, and we're talking about the heated, the non-acidic form of these cannabinoids. So THC, as we just learned, is the cannabinoid in cannabis that has the potential for impairment, or that's the one that makes you high. Now, we used to sort of use the word psychoactive, or it causes psychoactivity, which just means that it affects the brain. We're now trying to change the language, or at least the industry is changing the language a little bit to say the potential for impairment, because I can take a THC product and very little of it, and I will be high as a kite for hours at a time, where perhaps one of my colleagues will use the same amount or even 5 or 10 times the amount of THC that makes me high. They don't get high at all from it. So we all react a little bit differently. So THC has the potential for impairment, but not everybody will become impaired when they take a THC product, okay? CBD does not cause impairment. In fact, CBD kind of does the opposite. CBD is really becoming quite well known for getting rid of that foggy brain. So if you're having a hard time concentrating or just kind of feel fuzzy in your head sometimes, CBD can actually really clear that up. So they're really opposite, right? They're having that opposite effect, kind of opposing properties to them. So one thing that new users should really be aware of is that CBD products, most of them or a lot of them, unless they explicitly say, will contain a little bit of THC. If the CBD product is from hemp base, there's likely no THC in there, but most of the cannabis products that are on the market right now are from the cannabis plant. So there's the potential for a little bit of THC in there. For some people, we need that little bit of THC in order to make the product more effective. But for people who are really sensitive to THC, that can be quite detrimental, because if they're taking CBD to manage pain during the daytime and they're very susceptible to THC, even 0.1 milligrams per milliliter could cause some impairment. Or if they're taking 3 doses of that product, so they're taking, 1 mil in the morning, 1 at lunchtime, and 1 late in the day. So they're getting 0.1 milligram of THC first thing in the morning, and then again in the afternoon, and then again in the evening. So over the course of, say, 12 hours or so, they might get, maybe half a milligram or 1 milligram or 2 milligrams of THC. For most people, that's not going to be impairing at all, but there are some people out there that are quite sensitive to that, and it can stack up on top of each other so that by the end of the day, they might be feeling a little bit impaired. So it is one thing to just caution people, especially people who've never used cannabis before. They don't know what that feeling of high is like, so it might be a little bit alarming for them, or it might feel really uncomfortable for them as well. So we do have to look at that for new users or users that tell you that, hey, I'm really sensitive to THC, so you need to keep THC on the really low side if possible. One of the things with THC and the psychoactivity that we can get from THC is CBD actually counteracts that. So remember how we said THC has that potential for impairment, but CBD can actually clear the head of brain fog and stuff like that. So they're kind of working in tension with each other. So if someone is quite sensitive to THC, but they need higher amounts of THC in order to manage whatever medical condition that they have, but they find that that side effect of becoming impaired is really uncomfortable for them, we can add in some CBD to help to balance that out a little bit. And that can take a little bit of experimenting, because everybody's going to react a little bit differently. But just know that that's an option if you're helping someone trying to figure out what the right dose is or what the right product is that they do oppose each other, and we can use that to our advantage. So if someone is quite sensitive to THC, we add some CBD in there, and that will counteract some of those uncomfortable side effects. Some examples of a balanced product that we might want to use. Now there's some really great balanced products out on the market that might have like 1:5 or 1:1 or 1:3, those kinds of things. That's the ratio of THC to CBD. And then there are some really great ones that are actually quite equal, and we would call something a balanced product or equal as long as it's close to being the same amount of THC to CBD. With an oil, when the manufacturers are creating those oils, it's easy for them to just add in equal amounts of THC to CBD. But with a dry herb product, you might not find them in exact balance. So an example is like an oil that might have 10 milligrams per milliliter of THC and 10 milligrams per milliliter of CBD. That's a really nice balanced oil product. A dried flower, like I say, we might not find that exact 1:1 ratio. So maybe it's got 8% THC and maybe 10 or 12% CBD, or maybe switched around, or a 5% CBD and 10 or 14% THC. So we can look for those different ratios of how the THC and CBD kind of balance against each other, and we can use those to kind of tune in for if you're helping someone to figure out how they can really, the goal that we're looking for is people to be able to really manage their health conditions without having side effects, especially the side effect of being impaired. All right, let's look at a little bit more research. As the majority of research has gone into looking at THC and CBD, because those are the two main cannabinoids that we find in the cannabis plant. And we kind of looked at this before, but we'll just have another look at it again, is as attitudes towards cannabis change, we're going to get a lot more research. And here's some of the areas where research has happened a fair bit in the past. We can find quite a bit of it, and more, of course, we need much more research going into the future. So addiction mitigation, anxiety and mood disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, so any kind of neurological issues that are going on, so the MS and the Parkinson's, some of those kinds of issues, epilepsy and seizure disorders, a big area of research, sleep management, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, nausea and vomiting. Of course, we know that it works really well to help quell that. Liver and kidney disease, bone health. There's some really interesting studies going on in bone health, and likely there'll be some products out on the market to help with osteoporosis and arthritis in the next few years that will be cannabis-based. Eye health, reproductive health, immunity, cancer treatment, pain management, and multiple sclerosis as well. So we've kind of looked at some of those already, but let's take a look at a few more examples of studies. So cannabinoids as anti-inflammatory agents. Now, this study looked at both THC and CBD, which are plant-based cannabinoids, but it also looked at endocannabinoids, and those are the cannabinoids that our body creates itself, and we're going to have a whole lesson on that coming up. And then the synthetic cannabinoids, which are the lab-created cannabinoids. They studied all three of those, and this was a study in 2009, so it's getting a little bit ways back there at this point, but it suggests that cannabinoids manage the inflammatory response in 4 ways. So here's a direct quote from this study. Cannabinoids are potent anti-inflammatory agents, and they exert their effects through induction of apoptosis, so that is like a cell death, so it's kind of like the self-destruct button. If a cell has been damaged, it will usually just self-destruct itself so that it doesn't damage other cells. Inhibition of cell proliferation, which is really important for stopping the spread of cancer. Suppression of cytokine production, so cytokine production is where the immune system just works overtime, and that can cause a lot of problems. And in fact, if the immune system works too fast and too quickly, sort of is too powerful, it can actually cause death as well. So we want to look at that. And induction of T regulatory cells, and that's part of our immune system as well. So this is just some that's going on as far as using THC and CBD for pain medication. Another one looking at CBD and inflammation. CBD works so well to bring down inflammation throughout the body, works really well in gastrointestinal issues. The inflammation is really a natural part of our immune system. It's an important part of our immune system. Inflammation happens when the blood vessels, if there's an injury somewhere in the body, whether that's due to a toxin or an invader, so a virus or bacteria, or overuse of a body part, someone who gets the tennis elbow, those kinds of things. The body will kind of start to dilate those blood vessels. A lot of fluid will move into that area of injury, and then all the immune factors, the immune system sort of gets called. So it's like bringing all the ambulances to the area. So it brings all that immune factors to start healing that area of injury. When inflammation happens, often we can see it because there'll be a redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And that will usually start to go away. So that would be acute inflammation. That will start to go away as the body starts to heal. Unfortunately, if that inflammatory process doesn't get shut down, it turns into what's called chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation will start to just cause all kinds of problems in the body, really throw the body off balance. And they're starting to realize, researchers are starting to kind of think that the cause of all major health disorders or health diseases that can sometimes take years to sort of take hold on the body, it all starts with out of control inflammation, or this chronic inflammation. So if we can find a way to stop chronic inflammation in the body, then the body, not only are you more comfortable in the present day, but it will actually stop the progression of the disease processes as well. So one of the triggers of the inflammatory response is this release of the COX-2 enzyme in response to an injury. Now, the way that NSAIDs works are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, so that would be the over-the-counter drugs that you can purchase. It inhibits that COX-2 enzyme that causes the inflammation to start. CBD, and to a certain degree THC, also stop or block the COX-2 enzyme as well. So CBD seems to work just as well, and in some cases better, as some of your over-the-counter anti-inflammatory products that you can purchase at your local drugstore. Now, of course, we need much more research on this, and probably maybe some better products, more consistent products on the market as well. But again, this is an area where we're going to see some real big breakthroughs in these kind of products, because NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, if they're taken over time, they can actually start to cause liver and kidney damage. Where CBD, as far as we can tell so far, it doesn't actually cause that same kind of organ damage, but it actually starts to repair the organs in the body. So if we can manage some of these chronic conditions without causing further damage that will start to catch up with people as they age, why not? What a better product to have. And CBD shows some of that potential. We know CBD and seizure disorders. There's a lot of studies and a lot of anecdotal evidence providing strong evidence of CBD being used to help manage seizure disorders. There's actually a pharmaceutical drug on the market called Epidiolex, and that's been out for quite a few years, and that is an approved CBD-based pharmaceutical medication for the treatment of seizures. We also know that just a lot of cannabis products that are on the market. The Stanley brothers created Charlotte's Web, which is a high CBD cultivar that is being used with a lot of seizure disorders in children. So this is an area where we already have proven that CBD helps with this area, but we still need further research so we can really convince all of the doctors out there, because some of the doctors still don't really believe it. So here's a study involved 225 people randomly assigned to one of 3 treatment groups. The medication was given twice per day. Each of the treatment groups had a significant reduction in their seizures after the 28-day trial. So the people who were taking 20 milligrams of CBD twice a day, so that would be up to 40 milligrams of CBD a day, they had a 41.9% reduction in seizures over the 28-day period. The people taking half of that dose, so 10 milligrams of CBD twice a day, so it's a total of 20 milligrams during the day, they had a 37% reduction in seizure, which is still pretty great. And then the placebo group had a 17% reduction in seizures as well. Placebo is a really interesting concept that not a focus of this group, but you can see that the placebo effect is very real, but we also see that CBD basically doubles the efficacy of just the placebo. So lots still to learn as far as THC and CBD goes, but just know the main things to take away from this is that they are the 2 main cannabinoids in cannabis. They're the most studied cannabinoids at this point. 20 years down the road, we'll have lots of other cannabinoids out on the market where we have lots of research on them. But right now, the focus really is on THC and CBD.